Hi everyone. We've seen this story before. Fighter comes out of nowhere and shocks the world by defeating a legend. We then assume that this fighter must be the next big thing in their weight class, or even the next pound-for-pound king. And then we wait for them to come back and show us that was no fluke. But they don't. In fact, they never win again. This isn't just some quirky MMA thing either. This happens in all combat sports, even ones where there's no trash talking or bad blood involved. It happened in boxing with Buster Douglas. It happened in UFC with Matt Serra. It happened in Bellator with Brian Rogers. It's happened in Muay Thai with Sam Aoki. It's happened in K1 with Remy Bonjasky. It's happened in Japanese wrestling with Inoki. It's happened in American wrestling with Hulk Hogan even. But why does this happen? Why do so many fighters have one amazing night and never anything close to that ever again? Now, if you're watching this and you're thinking, who the hell are half these people? Well, that's part of the problem. See, when someone defeats a legend, we want to believe that they've taken the mantle. We want to believe that the torch has been passed. We think that there's this new, young, hot prospect that's going to take over the division. But the reality is most of those fighters nobody had heard of before. They were lucky to get the shot. They weren't even ranked in the top 15. So what did they do? Well, they got insanely lucky. Maybe their division was wide open, and they caught the eye of the bookmakers. Maybe someone pulled out in their region, and they were selected to be the next man up. Whatever the reason, they got their shot, and they shocked the world. Matt Serra is probably the best example of this. Matt was a TUF1 winner, who never really lived up to his potential. He spent 3 years fighting in Japan, and he only returned to the UFC with a record of 11-6. He was uneven ranked. Then he got a title shot because UFC needed someone to fill in for a last-minute injury. And then he defeated Georges St. Pierre in one of the biggest upsets in UFC history. But what happened next? Well, Serra came back to defend his title against GSP 2 months later, and he lost in less than a round. And while Matt did go on to have a few more solid years in the UFC, he never won another championship. So why did this happen? Why do we see this so often? Well, let me explain. First, we need to talk about the person doing the defeating. Now, for this to work, you can't be a great fighter. You have to be an average fighter. And I know this sounds weird, but it makes sense when you think about it. If you're an elite fighter, you'll probably go on a long winning streak. And then when you get your title shot, you're not going to lose it. Because if you're elite enough to go on a long winning streak, you're also elite enough to beat the current champion. So if you're an elite fighter, you shouldn't be a flash in the pan. The same goes for fighters who are so good that they're past their prime. When a washed-up fighter gets one last run in there and wins the title, that's not a flash in the pan. It's just a final run. You also can't be a fighter who's really limited. See, if you're an extremely technical boxer but you're not very athletic, you might catch an all-time great in a bad night, and you might be able to shock the world. But then when you move on to face other great boxers, you're going to lose. Think about Sam Aoki. Sam was a karate black belt, and he was an incredibly technical striker. But he had no real base in wrestling, and he couldn't deal with the clinch. This was fine when he was facing Muay Thai specialists like Peter Aerts. But when he moved on to face better competition, he struggled. And this leads us to the perfect flash in the pan. The perfect flash in the pan is an average fighter who gets insanely lucky. They're the equivalent of a Hail Mary pass. You do and throw a Hail Mary pass when you read down by 6 with 20 seconds left in the game. You throw it when you're already ahead and you want to make sure that you win. Buster Douglas is probably the best example of this. When Mike Tyson came into the 1990 fight with Buster Douglas, he was a 42-1 favorite. Douglas was coming off a loss to Oliver McCall. He'd lost 4 of his last 6 fights. And he was fighting in front of a sold-out hometown crowd for his opponent. His manager had recently passed away. His wife had filed for divorce, and he was a huge underdog. In other words, everything was going wrong for Buster Douglas. But then something clicked. Maybe it was the combination of the crowd and the emotions of the week. But whatever it was, Douglas shocked the world. What happened next? Well, Douglas came back for a rematch with McCall to try and win back his heavyweight title, and he lost. He then fought Evander Holyfield, and he lost. Dan fought in a non-title fight against the unranked Oliver McCall, and he lost again. The point here is Douglas didn't beat Tyson because he was the better fighter. He just had a great night.
Which brings us to our second point. Sometimes you have to have a little bit of luck.
Sometimes things just have to break your way. Take Brian Rogers, for example. Brian Rogers was a light heavyweight who never really made any noise in UFC until he got a title shot. He wasn't ranked. Nobody expected him to win. And he ended up defeating Quinton Jackson via split decision in one of the biggest upsets in UFC history. But when Rampage came back and defended his title against Lyoto Machida, he won easily. Rogers was obviously a really tough fight for Rampage, but it was nothing personal. When a fresh Rampage faced a smaller and slower opponent, he won convincingly. Then there's Remy Bonjasky. Remy was a kickboxer who was always exciting and always dangerous, but he could never quite get that elusive K1 World Grand Prix title. He'd make it to the finals every year, but he'd always come up short. Then in 2008, he finally reached the final. He was matched up against a rising star named Badr Hari. Now, Hari was a monster. He was a giant, he was powerful, and he seemed unbeatable. And honestly, Remy knew that he couldn't beat Hari in a 5-round decision. So when Hari came out of the corner in the first round and threw a spinning kick, Remy checked it. And when Hari stumbled, Remy threw a flying knee and knocked him out. But what happened next? Well, Hari would go on to defeat Remy 3 times. Point is, sometimes you just need everything to break your way. In the end, the reason this happens so often is because being a top-tier competitor is hard. It's hard to stay at the top of your game for years and years and even decades. It's hard to keep improving when you're already so good. And it's hard to deal with the pressures of being a champion. But the truth is, it's also hard to be lucky. Sometimes you just have a night where everything breaks your way and you shock the world. And then you never have a night like that again. So who will be the next flash in the pan? Who will be the next Matt Serra, or Buster Douglas, or Remy Bonjasky? Well, maybe it's the person you least expect. Maybe they'll come from a completely different weight class. Maybe they'll be a totally unknown prospect who nobody's ever heard of. All we can say is that when it happens, you'll be sure to watch. Thanks for watching.